We continue now at the top of Daf Tesam and Aleph and Maseches Horios. This is Horios Daf 9a. This Daf is sponsored by Alexander Rosenfeld in memory of Shmuel Zev ben Aaron Rosenfeld. Thank you for your sponsorship. If you would like to sponsor an Amud or Daf, see the description box below. And see the description box below to see how you can support this channel. On the previous summit, the Gemara asked, why is it that a Nasi does not bring the Karban Ola V'yored? And the Gemara now answers from a Braisa. Rabbi Yirmiyah would say that the Pasuk Karban Ola V'yored, it says, Lo Sagia Yodo, he's not able to afford it. V'nemar Lo Sasig Yodo, the same basic idea, he can't afford it. We'll take a look at the full psukim. The full psukim, this is by the discussion of Karban Ola V'yored, the variable chatos. Vimlo sagia yodo deisef. He can't afford the sef. He can't afford the sheep. Vehevi es hashamo asher chata shtei sorim o shnei bnei yona. Then he brings the bird karbanos. Vimlo sasig yodo l'shtei sorim o l'shnei bnei yona. If he can't afford that, vehevi es karbano asher chata asiris va'efa soles lechatos. He brings the karban mincha. That's what it says by the Karban Ola V'yored. And so we learn from there. Misha boli de anios va'ashiras. The Karban Ola V'yored applies only to somebody who can be in poverty and he can be in wealth. Yotza Nasi Mashiach. This would exclude a Nasi and it would exclude a Kohen Gadol as well. She'ein boyin lideanias. They can never become poor. And Rashi explains, Lo sagia yodo, lo sasig yodo, demashma, it's understood, Misha boli de anios vashiros, it's understood to be talking about somebody who can become poor and then become wealthy. To pa'amim aniu, pa'amim ashiro means to say that he sometimes is poor, sometimes he's wealthy. Hu de yeshno bekarban ola v'yored, that's the person who's part of the category of karban ola v'yored. Yotza Mashiach v'nasi, that excludes the Kohen Gadol, that excludes the Nasi, the king. The Leola Mashirim Haim, they're always wealthy, and so therefore they're not included in the Karban Ola V'yored. And the Gemara continues, Nasi by the king, Dichsiv, because it's written in the Pasuk by the Nasi, it says, V'yosa achas mikol mitzvahs Hashem elokav. It talks about Hashem, his God, and we darshan from that, Misha ein al gabav ella Hashem elokav. The only one above the Nasi, the only one above the king, is Hashem. And Mashiach, when it comes to the Kohen Gadol, Dichsiv, because it's written, V'hakohen hagadol me'achav, it says that the Kohen Gadol, the anointed Kohen Gadol, is greater from his brethren, shehu gadol me'achav. It means to say that he's greater from his brothers, benoi, in terms of beauty, bekoach, in terms of strength, bechachma, in terms of wisdom, uva-osher, and in terms of wealth. And so we see that the Kohen Gadol as well is a wealthy individual. And the Gemara continues, Acherim omrim, others say, Minayin shem ein lo gadleu mishalechav. How do we know that if he doesn't have wealth, that he should get it from his brothers? Talmud lomer v'hakohen hagadol me'echav. It says the Kohen is gadol me'echav from his brothers, asher yutzak al rosho. Again, that's poured on his head, the shemen hamishcha, and that means gadleu me'echav. You have to raise him up. You have to give him that wealth from among his brothers. And Rashi explains, Nasi she'ein al gabav shum adon. It means the Nasi has no master over him. El Hashem, only Hashem is over the Nasi, is over the king. Dahainu melech, again that refers to a king. Umelech liolam ashiru, and a king is always an ashir. A king is always wealthy. V'kohen gadol binan she'ei gadol me'echa ba'osher. And also when it comes to the Kohen Gadol, he has to be greater from his brothers in wealth. Delahava liolam ashir, he has to always be a wealthy individual. And the Gemara continues, Boy minei Ravina me Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Ravina asked Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak the following question. Nasi shenitztara, if you have a Nasi that gets tzaras, that gets leprosy, Mahu, what would be the halach over there? Mitcha dochi, is he pushed off? O mifter potter, or is he exempt? And Rashi explains the question, Nasir shenitztara l'Rabbi Yirmiyah, or Rabbi Yossi HaGlili, according to Rabbi Yirmiyah and Rabbi Yossi HaGlili, do avar minisiyuso she'in roy lios melech keshu mitzora. He no longer will be the Nasi, he's not fit to be the king when he's a mitzora. Kedamrinan l'kamon v'perek beis, we're going to say this later on in the second perek, vayinaga Hashem es hamelech vayi mitzora yomoso, vayoshav bebeis hachavshis demashma, shenase chavshim imalchuso. It sounds like from there that when he has tzaras, he's going to be free, so to speak, from being the king. So a Nasi shenitztara effectively is no longer king. So what would be the halacha? Mi amrinon potter mi karban ola v'yored. Do we say that he's exempt from the karban ola v'yored kishehu Nasi when he was a Nasi? V'achshav kishenitztara, now that he has saras, do you over minisiyu? So he's no longer the king l'chayev. So maybe he should be obligated to bring a karban ola v'yored. O dilmer, maybe maida have it. What happened kishehu Nasi when he was a Nasi. Kilomar, what that means to say is, Hoel v'nidcha yidcha, if he was already pushed off, he's pushed off, even kishenetztara, even when he has tzaras. That's one way to understand the phrasing of the question. Lishna achrin, another way to understand the question, midcha dochi lahai nesios mi karban ola v'yored lagamri. He's pushed off off from the Karban V'Yored totally, Dehoel V'Nidcha Yidcha Afilu Kashinit Stara. Since he's pushed off, he should be pushed off even with Saras. Odilmor, maybe Miftar Potter, he's exempt Nesias Mi Karban V'Yored, meaning the idea of when he's the king, he's exempt from Karban V'Yored. Uvizman Deleka Nesias Lachayev, and when there's no kingship, so then he's obligated. Dehainu Mishanit Stara, that would be again from when he has Saras. Again, so the question essentially is he obligated or not in Karban V'Yored? And the Gemara continues, Amar Lei, he said back to him, Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak answered Ravina, Diloch o de Gaza, when he would bring the Karban V'Yored, is it from your property, meaning is it from the public property, or is it de Gaza, is it from his personal treasury? And Rashi explains, Amar Lei said back to him, from what do you want to require that he's obligated? Lasuye carbon, to bring a carbon kashenet stara. When he does get saras, so let's say he's obligated to bring a carbon, from which money should he bring this carbon V'Yored? Mimaman shalcha, is he bringing it from your money? Or mimaman de Gaza didei? Or is he bringing it from his own money? Haviyomri mi Gaza didei de boy lasuye. Certainly he's going to bring it from his own money. The kavan de mi Gaza didei kaboy asuye, and since he would have to bring it from his own money, that's obvious. For that reason, we actually would say he's totally exempt mi Karban V'Yored from the Karban V'Yored. Dehachi kamer Rabbi Yirmiyah of Rabbi Yossi. That's what Rabbi Yirmiyah and Rabbi Yossi are saying. Yatsa nasi u'mashiach she'ein boin lidei anios. We're excluding a nasi and a kohen gadol who are not going to become poor. Hay nasi shenitztara nami. So when it comes to the nasi with tzaras as well, eino bo lidei anios. He's not going to become poor. The gaza didei kedekoi koi. His personal treasury will remain. Hilkach pater lagamri. Therefore, he is completely exempt. And the Gemara continues, Tanya, we learned in a Brisa, Rabbi Kiva Omer, Rabbi Kiva says, Moshiach Pater Mikulan, the anointed one, the Kohen Gadol, is completely exempt. Rashi explains, Tanya, Rabbi Kiva Omer, Mashiach Pater Mikulam. Rabbi Akiva says the Kohen Gadol is totally exempt, Mi Karban V'Yored. He is completely exempt from the Karban V'Yored. T'chsiv, as it's written, Ze Karban Aaron Uvanav Biyom Himashach Oso, Asiris Ha'efa. It talks about the Asiris Ha'efa that's brought by Aaron and his sons, Dahainu Chavise Kohen Mashiach. That's the carbon that we refer to as the Chavise of the Kohen Gadol. The Chavisin Bo Lo Chova means to say that Chavisin is an obligation for him. V'yein Acheres Bo Lo, but there's no other, the Asiris Ha'efa Olav Yored Lo Bo Lo Chova. There's an Asiris Ha'efa also when it comes to the Karban Olav Yored. If the person bringing the Karban Olav Yored is poor, so then he brings an Asiris Ha'efa. But that Asiris Ha'efa he doesn't have to bring. It's only the Asiris Ha'efa that he brings that's called the Chavise Kohen Gadol. Helkach, therefore, Pater Mikulam, therefore he's exempt from all of them. May Olav Yored, from all the variable kinds of Olav Yored. Again, Olav Yored could be an animal, a bird offering, or it can be that Asiris Ha'efa. Once he's exempt from Asiris Ha'efa, he's completely exempt. Now we're going to say later on to mi par lo pater le Rabbi Akiva, that actually Rabbi Akiva does not exempt him from bringing a par. He would have to bring a par when it comes to a situation of Karban V'Yored. V'ikal l'terutze, the time of the Rabbi Akiva, mishum da'ola v'yored, mishum de'me'ola v'yored, hu de'imit. You can answer and you can explain that the reasoning of Rabbi Akiva is that he's exempt from the Karban V'Yored. K'nechsiv zeh Karban Aaron, like it says, this is the Karban of Aaron. Aval mi par lo imit, but in terms of bringing a par, the Kohen Gadol actually would bring a par. What it means to say is the Kohen Gadol brings a par in a situation where he issues a mistaken ruling and then acts upon that ruling. That's where a Kohen Gadol brings a par similar to the par that is brought in the situation of the par hel davar shel tzibor, again in a situation of a mistaken ruling of the Sanhedrin. So that he's going to bring even in a situation where he would have brought a Karban V'Yored, again in a typical situation would have been a Karban V'Yored. So a mistaken ruling in that situation does in fact result in bringing a par. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rava says, my time with Rabbi Akiva, what's the reason of Rabbi Akiva? Amar Kratz, because the Pasuk says, as Rashi just mentioned, Zeh Karban Aaron Uvanov, this is the carbon of Aaron and his sons, Zuba Chovalo, this is an obligation for him, V'yein Acheres Ba Chovalo, but there's not another kind of Asiris Oefa that is an obligation for him. And the full pasuk over here is Zeh Karban Aaron Uvanav Asher Yakrivu Hashem Biyom Himashach Oso. On the day he's anointed, Asiris Oefa Solas Mincha Tamid Machatzisa Baboker Umachatzisa Bo'erev. You're going to bring that Asiris Oefa half in the morning and half in the evening. And so again, that's the exclusion from the Asiris Oefa, meaning to say from the Asiris Oefa and from the entire idea of Karban V'Yored. But the Gemara continues and asks, Ve'ema, but why don't we say Ki Mimet Le Rachmana Midale Dalus? Maybe the Kohen Gadol is just excluded from bringing the Karban V'Yored that's brought when the person is extremely poor, that he brings a Karban Mincha. That would refer to the Asiris Ha'efa. ba'ashiras, but let's say the carbon when he's just a poor person who brings a bird offering, or let's say the carbon when he's wealthier, he brings an animal. So lo mi'atei rachmana, maybe the Kohen Gadol is not excluded from that. And the Gemara says to that, Lo sal gadaitach, don't let that enter your mind, Chsiv, because it's written in the pasuk, V'chiper olav hakohen al chataso asher chata me'achas me'ela, and it means to say, ha-mischaper bi'achas, if you're able to have a kapara with one of them, mischaper b'kul, and you have a kapara with all of them, v'she'ein mischaper bi'achas, but if you can't have a kapara with one of them, like in this case, dali dalus does not apply to the Kohen Gadol, then ein mischaper b'kul, and then there's no atonement with all of them, then he's completely excluded from the carbon olav yored. And Rashi explains, Zema, why don't we say, Ki mi'atei kro l'kohen Mashiach, when the pasuk excludes the Kohen Gadol, midale dalus, maybe that's just from the very poorest of the karbanos, tahainu me'asiris ha'efa, that would be from the asiris ha'efa, techsiv zeh karban aron, like we said, it says zeh karban aron, dein acheres asiris ha'efa balo chovi, you don't have any other asiris ha'efas for him that are obligations, but midalus lo mi'atei, but let's say from the regular poor karban, at the al shmias kol uvitois vasayim, v'tumas mikdash v'kadoshav, again on these three cases where you bring the variable chatos, l'chayev kispo, seiro, toron of neona, then he should be chayev to bring either the animal carbon or the bird carbon. And the Gemara says, lo sal kadaitach, don't let that enter your mind, because it's written, gave asiris ha'efa. By the asiris ha'efa, it's written, v'chiper olav hakohen me'achas me'ela, it says again, me'achas me'ela, demashma kol mischaper bi'achas. It sounds like it's saying, it has to be mischaper bi'achas, kolomar, meaning to say, b'chol achas v'achas. It has to be possible to bring every kind of kapara. Afilu ba'asiris ha'efa, even the asiris ha'efa, then mischaper b'kul, and then he can bring atonement with all of them. The yeshno ba'ashiros uv'dalos uv'dali dalos. In other words, he has to be included in dali dalos in order to be included in all of them, in ashiras dalos and dali dalos. And therefore, since in this situation the Kohen Gadol is not able to bring the carbon of dali dalos, so he doesn't bring any of those carbonos in terms of carbon olav yored. V'she'ein mischaper bi'achas mehen, if he can't bring one of them, could go in Mashiach, by the Kohen Gadol, devadei mischaper ba'asiris ha'efa, techsiv zeh carbon, he certainly can't bring the asiris ha'efa, as it says zeh carbon, so ein mischaper b'kulam, he doesn't bring all of them, the imet nami deino b'carbon olav yor klal, meaning it's completely excluded from carbon olav yored. But the Gemara continues and asks, Ela me'ata, but according to that, that it's written also by the carbon olav yored, v'hoya kiyesham la'achas me'ela, if he's guilty with one of these averis, again, the averis of shmias kol, of bitois vasayim, of tumas mikdash v'kadoshav, so hachanami, we should make the same drasha. D'chol ha-mischaya bi'achas mischaya b'kul, and if he's able to be liable for one of them, he's liable for all of them. V'shein mischaya b'achas, but if one of them doesn't apply, ein mischaya b'kulan, so then he's not going to be chayiv in any of them. And so therefore, we have the following question. Alama Tanan, why did we learn in the Mishnah, Rabbi Akiva says, Nasi chayiv chutz mishmias kol, that the Nasi, the king, is chayiv the carbon olav yored in all of the cases except for shmias kol. How can he be excluded from one of them but then be included in the others? And the Gemara says, Abaye v'Rava d'Amri Tarvayu, Abaye and Rava, they both say, Me'achas mashmalei, to make this kind of drasha from the word me'achas, that we're going to make the drasha. There we can say that it means it's all or none. But liachas, but when it says liachas, like it says, V'hoya ki yesham liachas me'ela, lo mashmalei, so there that's not understood in that fashion, and therefore it's possible by the nasi to be excluded from one and not from the others. And the Gemara says, Umaishna me'achas to mashmalei, and what's the difference that me'achas is understood in this fashion? The kosvei rachmona levasof gabe asiris ha'efa, that's written, the Torah writes that at the end, by asiris ha'efa, l'meimer, and it means to say, the chol de mechayib asiris ha'efa mechayib bekulan, anyone who's chayiv by asiris ha'efa is chayiv in all of them. Disal gadaitach mischayib ba'achas, afa pishein mischayib bekulan, because if one would think that you can be chayiv in one of them, even though he's not chayiv in all of them, nichtavei lahai me'achas me'ela bedalus, then you could have written that phrase of me'achas me'ela either by the regular poor carbon, inami ba'ashiras, or by the wealthy carbon. The fact that they wrote it specifically at the end by asiris ha'efa, that says again that it's all or nothing. If he's excluded from asiris ha'efa, he's excluded from everything in terms of carbon olav yored. And Rashi explains, Zela me'ata, but according to that, Haidach siv liachas me'ela, hachanami dechol de mechai b'achas, we should make the same drasha by liachas me'ela, kolomer b'chol achas v'achas mechai b'kulan. He's got to be chayiv in every one in order to be chayiv in total. V'shein mischai b'achas, if he's excluded even from one. Could go Nasi, for example, a Nasi, the king, shein mischai b'shmias hakol, like we said, he's not chayiv by shmias hakol, because he's not someone that is called to testify. Eino chayiv b'kulan, so he shouldn't be chayiv in all of them. Kedam Rabbi Yossi Haglili, like Rabbi Yossi Haglili actually said. V'hachutz mishmias kol katani, but it says, with the exception of shmias kol, the katani Rabbi Akiva Omer, that Rabbi Akiva says, hanasi chayev bekulan chutz mishmias hakol, that the nasi is chayev, the carbanola v'yored by all of them, except for shmias hakol. You can exclude just one. Di'af agav dein mischai ba'achas, me'en mischai b'shar kulan. Even though he's not chayev in one of them, he can be chayev in the others. And so the Gemara said, me'achas me'ela, that we understand in that fashion, because otherwise, nichtave rachmona l'hai me'achas bedalus. You could have written the me'achas by the regular poor carbon, betornu v'nayona, by the bird carbonos. Inami ba'ashira, so write it by the wealthy. Dahainu kisbo seira, by the animal carbonos. Elami dekasa be rachmona me'achas kabe asira so'efa. The fact that me'achas is written by the dale dalus, by the asira so'efa, that is lamemer, that's specifically to say, to shein mischai ba'asir so'efa, that if he's not chayiv in asir so'efa, ein mischai b'kulan, he's not chayiv in all of them, klal at all, hilkach potter Mashiach mikulan. That's why the Kohen Mashiach, that's why the Kohen Gadol is potter from all of them. Hoel vein mischaper ba'asir so'efa, since he's not chayiv in asir so'efa, techsiv zeh korban, like it says zeh korban dein acheres ba'lo chova, he doesn't have another kind of asir so'efa as an obligation. It's specifically written by asir so'efa, where we find the Kohen Gadol is excluded from any other kind of asir so'efa. So again, we darshan in this fashion that he's not chayiv in all of them. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Kol ha-mitzvahs shebetorah, all mitzvahs in the Torah, shechayav and al zdon and kares, v'al shegagos and chatos, if you're chayiv on those mitzvahs, if you do them on purpose, if you violate them on purpose, you're chayiv kares, and by mistake, you're chayiv to bring a chatos. So in all of those cases, hayachin mevi kispa useira, an individual, he brings a female sheep or a female goat, v'han-nasi soyer, the nasi brings a sor, a male goat, u'mashiach u'bezdin, and the Kohen Gadol, and bezdin mevi and par, they bring a bull. U'v'avodas kochavmen, by avodah zara, hayachid v'han-nasi v'ha-mashiach, the individual, and the king, and the Kohen Gadol, mevi and seira, they bring a female goat, u'bezdin par v'sor, and bezdin brings a bull, and a male goat, par la'ola v'sor l'chatos, the par is as a carbanola, the sor is a chatos, and asham talui, with regards to an asham talui, hayachid v'hanasi chayav, and the individual and the king, they are chayiv, u'mashiach u'bezdin peturin, and the Kohen Gadol and bezdin, they are potter when it comes to an asham talui. Asham vadai, when it comes to an asham vadai, a certain asham, not the asham talui, hayachid v'hanasi v'hamashiach chayav, and the individual, the king, the Kohen Gadol, they are all chayiv, u'bezdin peturin, and bezdin is exempt by an asham vadai. Al shmias hakol ve'al bitois fasayim ve'al tumas mikdash ve'kadashav. Again, shmias hakol is when someone has to take an oath that they don't know testimony in a certain case, and then they take a false oath. Bitois fasayim is also a false oath, and tumas mikdash ve'kadashav is making the mikdash or making kodesh impure. So on those, bezdin petur, and bezdin is exempt. V'hayochid v'hanasi v'hamashiach chayav, and in the individual and the king and the Kohen Gadol, they're chayiv. Ela she'ein Kohen Gadol mashiach chayiv al tumas mikdash ve'kadashav, except that a Kohen Gadol is not chayiv when it comes to Tumas Mikdash v'Kadashav. Divrei Rabbi Shimon, this is the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. Umahein Mevin, and what do they bring in this case? Carbanola v'Yored. They bring the variable carbon chatos, what's called the carbanola v'Yored. Rabbi Lazar Omer, Rabbi Lazar says, Hanasi mevi soyer, that the nasi in this case, the king in this case, brings a male goat. And we will take a look at Rashi, and most of these Rashis bring the sources that we've already brought earlier. Kol ha-mitzvah shabatorah shechayav al zdon and kares ve'al shegegasan Mashiach u'bezdin mevi and par. Kedamin alel, we said this earlier, Nemar kan olev, Nemar lahalan legalos servas olel, learn from alel. V'nasi yolef mi mitzvahs yachid v'im nefesh yilmo tachton mi-elyon. We said earlier, you learn what is below from that which is above. Uv'avodas kochavim yachid v'nasi u'mashiach meviim seira. By avodah zara, the yachid, the nasi, and the Kohen Gadol, they bring the seira, dechsiv parshas Shlach lecha ba'avodas kochavim v'im nefesh v'chulan bechlal nefesh achas, and all of these are included as a nefesh achas, one soul. U'bezin mevi'in par v'sor, bezin brings a par and sor, kedechsiv parshas Shlach lecha v'yamar le'el yolef me'enei ma'alahalan bezin afkan bezin. We learned that out. Me'enei also said earlier. Asham talui hayachid v'hanasi chayavim bezin u'mashiach peturim. When it comes to an asham talui, the individual and the nasi are chayav, bezin, and the Kohen Gadol are potter, kedamar breish pirkin, like we say in the beginning of our parak, tichsib b'asham talui v'chipar hakohen al shegegaso asher shogag misha cheto v'shegegaso shava. We say that the sin and the shogeg have to be even, they have to be equal. equal. And so again, that's why we exclude the Bezin and the Kohen Gadol, because in those cases, you have a mistaken ruling and then an action. Asham Vaday Yachid V'Nasi Mashiach Chayavin, when it comes to a regular Karban Asham, the individual, the king, and the Kohen Gadol are Chayav, D'chsiv Ba'ashamos V'im Nefesh, V'Nasi Mashiach B'chlal Nefesh Achas, saying again it says Nefesh, and a Nasi and Mashiach are included in that. Now that which we said earlier in the Mishnah, that they're only chayev if it's something where on purpose is kares and b'shogeg is a chatos, v'yasham v'aday ein shegegas chatos, and of course by a regular case of a karban asham, that's not a case where if you do a b'shogeg it's a chatos, v'chein hamashiach, and it says over there v'chein hamashiach, so this Rashi already explained earlier, hachi mashma, all it means is as follows, v'chein hamashiach degabei asham v'aday, Parhu de lo yavi, meaning to say by a Kohen Gadol, when it comes to Asham Vadei, there's not a scenario where you bring the par. Aval Asham Vadei yavi kadyon, but he does in fact bring the regular carbon of Asham Vadei like a regular person. Ubezin Peturim Asham Vadei, Bezin is exempt from Asham Vadei. The Peturim Lagamri Deinan Bechlal Nefesh Achas, they're not included in Nefesh. Al Shmias Kol Uvitois Vasayim V'Tumas Mikdash V'Kadoshav, Bezin Peturim, Bezin is Potter on all of those cases of the Ola V'Yored, of the variable Chatos. The Yamar Le'alein Chatos Tzibor Ela B'Kvua. We said earlier that when it comes to the Tzibor, they only bring the Chatos that's Kvua, the fixed Chatos. V'Hani Ola V'Yored Ninu, these are Ola V'Yored, again they're variable. Yachid v'nasi Mashiach chayavin b'shmias kol uvitos fasayim v'tumas mikdash v'kadoshav. The individual, the king, and the Kohen Gadol are chayiv by all of these cases that are, again, the Karbanol of Yored, the Kulan b'chlal nefesh achasein. They're all included in nefesh achas. Elashen Kohen Gadol Mashiach chayiv al tumas mikdash v'kadoshav divrei Rabbi Shimon, but the Kohen Gadol is not chayiv by tumas mikdash v'kadoshav mefarish b'Gemara. That's going to be explained in the Gemara. V'hu adin dekam Rabbi Shimon elashen hanasi chayiv al shmias hakol. Rabbi Shimon would likewise say that the king is not chayiv by shmias kol, which has to do with testifying. The melech lo meid v'lo midin also, because you don't make a king testify. Ela lo itzrich le'la misna, you don't have to teach that though. To hatana le'el Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva already taught that earlier. Umahin mevi'in nasi bevitois vasayim v'tumas mikdash v'kadashav. What does the nasi bring by bitois vasayim, by the false oath and by tumas mikdash v'kadashav? Umashiach v'shmias kol uvitois vasayim, and the Kohen Gadol by shmias kol and bitois vasayim. What do they bring? Karban olav v'yored. Again, they bring the variable karban chatos. Rabbi Lazar Omer nasi mevi soyer. Rabbi Lazar says the nasi brings the soyer. V'shalosh machlukas bedavar. It ends up being a three-way machlukas. Rabbi Yossi Aglili savar nasi Mashiach petur mikulan. Rabbi Yossi Aglili says the king and the Kohen Gadol are totally exempt. Rabbi Akiva savar nasi chai bekulan chutz mishmias hakol. Rabbi Akiva holds that the nasi, the king, is chayiv in all of them except for shmias hakol, which has to do with testimony. Umashiach pater mikulan me'olav yored, and the Kohen Gadol is pater from all of them from olav yored. Rabbi Shimon savar. Rabbi Shimon holds nasi umashiach chayavin bekulan ba'olav yored. The king and the Kohen Gadol are chayiv by all of them by olav yored. Elashem Kohen Gadol umashiach chayiv al tumas mikdash v'kadashav, except that the Kohen Gadol is not chayiv and Tumas Mikdash v'Kadashav. And the Gemara says, Tanya, we learned in a Brisa, Rabbi Shimon Hayanosin Klal, Rabbi Shimon had the following rule: Kol sha'ayachid ba'asham taloi, any situation where an individual brings an asham taloi, hanasi kayotze bo, the king is similar to him, Mashiach u bezdin peturin, and the Kohen Gadol and Bezin would be exempt. V'chol shu b'asham vadai, and any time the individual brings an asham vadai, nasi u Mashiach kayotze bohen, the king and the Kohen Gadol are similar, u bezdin peturin, and Bezin is exempt. Shmias hakol u vitois vasayim and tumas mikdash v'kadashav. When it comes to shmias hakol, vitois vasayim and tumas mikdash v'kadashav, those are the cases of karban olav yored, the variable chatos, bezdin peturin, so there Bezin is exempt, nasi u Mashiach chayav, and the king and the Kohen Gadol are chayiv, elashein hanasi chayiv b'shmias hakol, except that the king is not chayiv by shmias hakol, because again he doesn't testify, v'lo Mashiach b'tumas mikdash v'kadashav, and the Kohen Gadol is not included in tumas mikdash v'kadashav. Kol shu ba'olav v'yored, anything which is a variable chatos, nasi kayotze bo, the nasi is the same, Mashiach u bezdin peturin, and the Kohen Gadol and the bezdin are pater. And the Gemara continues, Hagufa Kash, it's a contradiction what was just stated with regards to the karban olav v'yored. Amrit, first you said, Shein Mashiach chayiv b'tumas mikdash v'kadashav, that the Kohen Gadol is not chayiv by tumas mikdash v'kadashav, so b'tumas mikdash v'kadashav would depart. That implies that he's exempt only by tumas mikdash v'kadashav. Aval b'shmias hakol uvitos vasayim chayiv, but the other cases of karban olav v'yored, which is shmias hakol and bitos vasayim, again having to do with the oath for testimony and false oath, those he'd be chayiv. But But then look at the end of the statement. Kol shu ba'olav yored. Anything that's olav yored, nasi kayotze bo. The nasi, the king, is the same. Mashiach hu bezdin peturin, and it says that the Kohen Gadol and Bezdin are potter. Chatani Mashiach hu bezdin peturin. If it's saying that the Kohen Gadol and Bezdin are potter, ma bezdin peturin mikulon. If you're saying they should be similar, so just like Bezdin is exempt from all of them, af Mashiach potter mikulon. So too Kohen Gadol should be potter from all of them. And Rashi explains, Hayanosin ben Klal, he had a rule, Kol shu ba'olav yored, dehainu shmias kol, uvitois vasayim, v'tumas mikdash v'kadashav. Again, olav yored is those three cases that we keep mentioning. Shmias kol, bitois vasayim, and tumas mikdash v'kadashav. Mashiachu bezdin peturin, so the Kohen Gadol and Bezdin are exempt. Mashiach dumya de Bezdin. And again, we should assume, if you're making that statement, that the Kohen Gadol is similar to Bezdin. Ma bezdin peturim mikulu, just like Bezdin is exempt from all of them. Mishmias hakol, uvitois vasayim, v'tumas mikdash v'kadashav. From shmias hakol, bitois vasayim, because again, a community only brings the fixed carbon chatos. Af Mashiach pater mikulu. So to the Kohen Gadol should be totally exempt, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Tes Amud Beis.